Mindy Weisel is driven by an internal mission to preserve the beauty in life through her paintings. Her canvases are filled with light, bright colors, and flowers, but once they only showed darkness because she wanted to reflect the pain derived from the knowledge that her grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all perished at the hands of the Nazis. Her parents both survived Auschwitz. You're the only daughter of Holocaust survivors. Can you tell me a little bit about how did they survive?
It's a very good question. My mother and father were young. My mother was 22 when she was taken to Auschwitz from her family Passover Seder table. She was one of 11, and the Nazis came, knocked on the door, took her family away. She never saw anyone but 3 remaining brothers out of 11 children. Her sisters were all killed. And she was taken to Auschwitz right away, and they discovered very early on that she had a blood type that was rare and that was good for the military. So they gave her an extra measure of soup every day, and that's how she survived. So my whole life I used to hear, "Don't worry, Mindel, I'll be fine, I have good blood." And I didn't really get the story till she died. And ironically enough, she died of lymphoma. But my father was 19, he was younger than my mother, and he was taken from his family home. 9 out of 11 survived the war, 9 siblings, but his parents and 2 youngest siblings were killed. And when he got to Auschwitz, they asked him, do you have a trade? Does anybody do machinery? And my father said he could do barber. He could be a barber. So that's how he survived. He got an extra ration because he shaved the heads of the inmates for a year. They were both in Auschwitz for a year. And then they were cousins, they were related, and after the war they were liberated, and Bergen-Belsen, which had been a camp, was turned into a displaced persons camp. And they went to Bergen-Belsen. There was a hospital there. They each heard that they had a cousin alive, and they found each other, and my father nursed my mother back to health, and they got married and lived there for 3 years waiting for papers to come to America, and that's where I was born. So they were one of the first weddings in Bergen-Belsen. I was the first child born on January 7th, 1947, to these survivors. What did your parents teach you that helped you become successful and to thrive as an artist? Well, that's also a really good question, because I never thought of myself as being successful in any way, but there was no question that your life had to have meaning. There was no question. You survived, and you were this first child born to these survivors. 2,000 survivors lived in this displaced persons camp, and you had to grow up and be everything. You had to be everything to these people and to the people that were lost. So this is a really wonderful story. My father was just here this week visiting me from California, and he's 84. And he has such an incredible spirit. You ask him, how are you? I'm wonderful. And, I had 63 years that my friends didn't have, and he witnessed so much, and he's not bitter, and he appreciates the moment. And he says to me, Min, I don't understand why anybody gets up past 5 o'clock in the morning, because from 5 to 9 you could live a whole life. And then he says to me, it's these stairs in your house. He says, it's not that they're just bad for your knees, but it's such a waste of time. And then he had to get ready for the airport at 6:30 in the morning. 5:30, I come downstairs, he's dressed, he's ready to go. There's this sense of not wasting a minute. And I got that over the top, like really crazy making, like I can't waste a minute. I have had more articles and interviews and everything written about me personally, and the theme is always, I never feel it's enough. I'm never going to, successful is not a word in my vocabulary. I'm never going to do enough. I'm never going to be enough. I'm never going to accomplish enough. Now, of course, as I'm getting older, and I have 3 daughters and 5 grandchildren, and I have enjoyed a wonderful career where I have made really heartfelt work out of my life, I'm very grateful. I just am filled with gratitude more than any other emotion.
Can you tell me a little bit about what your art is about, and how does it reflect
the pain that your family experienced?
Well, I've been painting for 30 years, and in 1978, I was doing graduate work at American University, and had a professor who said that real art should come from a real place in the self. And I got a studio downtown Washington, D.C., and started becoming obsessed, but I mean obsessed, with my father's number, and did close to 100 paintings with my father's number. And I would call him every day in California and say, tell me a story. I needed to hear more. I was 31 years old, and I was starting to understand what my parents had really gone through, and I felt a real need to express it in my paintings. So over 30 years, the painting always reflects a very real emotional passage. So after the Holocaust paintings, where I worked for a year in a cold studio in downtown Washington, working with dark, in 1981, by the time I was ready for a new series, that was an explosion of color called Lily and Blue. When my mother came to, all my work has blue in it, cobalt blue. Because when my mother came to America, she had two aunts in America, her mother's sisters, had come to America in the teens, 1915, whatever, and her two aunts met her at the boat, and they gave her some beautiful dresses. My mother was always very elegant, and they were cobalt blue, and my mother wore that color her whole life. So to me, that was the survival of beauty, that cobalt blue.
Would you have been as driven to produce all these paintings, which are shown all around the world, if you were not Jewish, with this pain of your family in your background?
I think the drive, they're great. I mean, there are artists who are driven. I think you have to be driven to make art. Not all artists are Jewish. So you have to be driven. What creates the drive is not such a mystery in my case. For me, it was a very strong desire to make a mark and to say something about my family's story and about life itself. I don't do Holocaust paintings. I haven't since 1979. I do paintings that celebrate life, or I did a whole series called Black Gifts. The critics said it was like a Jewish Charlie Parker solo. It was, Black Gifts, meaning that my life was such a gift, but I was born into such blackness. So there's a very strong, there's just such a intense emotion inside me of loving life, but being anxious, wanting to live in the moment, yet there's so much loss in the background. And so it's always working to, I think the greatest accomplishment now at this stage in my life is learning to live in the moment. To just be right here. There's no place else we can be. We cannot predict the future. We can't change the past. And you just are right here.
I guess the final question
Yes.
is that in this book, Stephen L. Pease writes that Jews represent such a tiny fraction of the world's population, and yet they succeed mightily in the fields of the arts, business and finance, economics. The 54% of the world's chess champions are Jewish.
Right.
And I guess my question is, how do you explain that?
I think that the emphasis on learning is very, very strong in a Jewish home. I think it's really vital. You weren't encouraged. I can tell you my husband was not encouraged to go play baseball, but he went to learn Hebrew and Talmud and the Bible and had a double load at school. And most everyone I know has been driven that way. And I think there's a very strong drive and probably a genetic intellectual ability and a real desire to accomplish. I think is very strong culturally.
Thank you, Mindy.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Candy.